The land manager from First Consolidated Agricultural Credit paused when the girl spoke. He was a tall man in a pressed shirt. Dennis Kavanaugh, 44 years old, 11 years with the bank's Asset Recovery Division, and he had just finished explaining to a group of county commissioners in Crawford County, Kansas, why the bank's newly acquired 200-acre parcel would be released in good order by spring. He had a folder in his hand. He had a prepared answer for most questions. He did not have a prepared answer for a 12-year-old girl in barn boots who raised her hand from the third row of the county extension hall and told him the north draws on sections 14 and 15 were going to blow out in the first heavy rain. He looked at her the way adults look at children who have said something unexpected in a room full of other adults. Not unkind. Not dismissive, exactly, just the particular look that says, "We will move on now." He moved on. That was the first week of March 2011. By the third week of April, sections 14 and 15 had lost 700 feet of subsurface drainage tile across 4 draws. The north access road was impassable to anything heavier than a pickup, and First Consolidated Agricultural Credit had a land management problem that no folder had prepared Dennis Kavanaugh to answer. The girl's name was Claire Aldrich. She was right, and she knew she was right before she raised her hand. And the only thing she hadn't known was what the room would do about it. Now you know what the room did. Most people who watch stories like this scroll past without ever subscribing. But if you've ever been talked over, looked past, or dismissed because of how small or young you were, if you know what it is to be right and have nobody in the room believe you yet, stay with us. Subscribe. This one is for you. Crawford County sits in the southeast corner of Kansas, hill country by Kansas standards, with more tree cover and creek drainage than people picture when they think of the state. The land there is not the flat open wheat country of the West. It rolls. It dips into draws and creek bottoms, and it has a layer of fractured limestone at varying depths below the topsoil that can make drainage either very good or, in the wrong place, complicated in ways that are not obvious until you've watched the ground through 2 or 3 wet springs. A person familiar with Cherokee County or Labette County to the south would recognize the terrain. Someone from Wichita or Topeka might look at a soil survey and see adequate cropland. These are different things. The Aldrich Farm, 320 acres of row crop and pasture ground on the south edge of Cherokee Township, had been in the family since 1947. When Claire's great-grandfather Harmon Aldrich had bought it from a neighbor who was getting out at $38 an acre, which even then was considered a modest price, because the ground had a reputation for going soft in wet years. The family had learned to work with it. 3 generations had walked that fence line in every season, and knew, without having to be told, which draws ran water and which ran trouble. The farm sat adjacent to the eastern boundary of what had been the Dunmore family operation, a large mixed grain and cattle outfit that had accumulated to 5,200 acres across 4 decades of careful buying in Crawford and the northern edge of Cherokee County, and had gone into receivership in the fall of 2010 when the Dunmore family's operating debt, $1 million on a line that had been extended 3 times in 5 years, finally came due in a year when cattle prices and crop revenues both fell short. First Consolidated Agricultural Credit had held the primary lien. By December 2010, they held the land. The bank's internal appraisal had valued the 5,200 acres at $2 million, roughly $615 per acre on average, which accounted for the variation between the productive upland ground on the south and west sections and the more marginal creek bottom and draw acres in the north. That was the asset on First Consolidated's books. Dennis Kavanaugh's job was to manage it well enough that the bank eventually recovered close to that number. He had done this before, in Indiana and in central Missouri, and he had a system for it. The system did not include a line item for asking the neighbors what they knew. A woman named Patsy Griswold, who had worked the counter at the Crawford County Extension Office in Girard for 29 years, remembered the winter of 2010-2011 as a quiet one in terms of farm transfers. Most people in the county were watching to see what the bank would do with the Dunmore ground before making any moves of their own. She remembered seeing Dennis Kavanaugh at the extension office twice that winter, pulling drainage records and soil survey maps. He was thorough about what he looked at. He looked at the right documents. He just looked at them from a desk. In February, when the ground was frozen and the draws were dry, and the wet seep signature in sections 14 and 15 was invisible under 2 inches of frost. The bank had brought Kavanaugh in to oversee the asset management plan. He was competent. He was organized. He had managed distressed agricultural assets in 3 other states. He had not managed ground in southeast Kansas before. Claire Aldrich was in the 3rd row of the Crawford County Extension Hall that March evening because her father, Galen Aldrich, had brought her. Galen was 41 that year, a quiet man who rarely attended public meetings, but had made an exception because the Dunmore ground shared 3 miles of fenceline with his own east boundary, and he wanted to hear the bank's management plan with his own ears before making any assumptions. He had driven to the meeting in his Ford F-250. Which had a cracked windshield on the passenger side that he had been meaning to replace since the previous September, and that he looked at every time he drove west into the sun and thought, "I'll get to that." Claire had come because Galen asked her if she wanted to come, and she had said yes. She was in 7th grade at the time. She carried a spiral notebook that she used for farm notes and homework interchangeably, because in her household those 2 categories were not always distinct. She sat in the chair beside her father and did not talk to anyone before the meeting started. A man named Virgil Hewitt, who farmed 400 acres just north of the highway and who had been at every extension meeting in Crawford County since 1987, sat 1 row behind them and said afterward that he remembered the girl because she was the only person under the age of 40 in the hall. Galen Aldrich had been teaching Claire to read ground since she was old enough to follow him across a field without slowing him down, which had been at around age 6. He did not use the word teaching. He did not explain things in the manner of instruction. He simply walked and pointed occasionally and named what he saw in the plain language of a man who had been watching the same land for 20 years. He would stop at a fence post and say, "See how the grass is rank right there." He would look at a draw in July and say, "That tile's moving water, it shouldn't be moving." He did not follow up with explanations. He seemed to expect that repeated observation would do the work, and in Claire's case it had. She had been walking the Dunmore fence with him since she was 7 years old. She knew the north draws the way you know ground you've crossed on foot in every season, where the water moved, where it didn't, where the old Dunmore tile lines ran shallow enough that the plowed ground above them showed a faint seam after a rain. She knew that sections 14 and 15 had a specific problem. 2 of the main lateral tile lines crossed a zone of fractured limestone at a depth of less than 18 inches, and the Dunmores had been nursing a slow failure in one of those laterals for at least 4 years. She knew because she had heard Galen say so to her uncle at the kitchen table in 2009, and because she had walked that draw herself in October of that year and seen the wet seep, a dark patch of ground 12 inches across, appearing in dry weather 30 feet from where the tile outlet should have been. She had written about it in her spiral notebook when she got home. Not because she thought she'd need it. Just because that was what you did with things worth remembering. She did not raise her hand immediately when Dennis Kavanaugh described the spring management plan. She listened to the whole presentation. She wrote 2 things in her notebook. She raised her hand at the end when he asked for questions. He called on her because she was the only person with a hand up. He probably expected a child's question. Something about animals, or what would happen to the old Dunmore machinery. She told him the north draws on sections 14 and 15 had failing subsurface tile in a fractured limestone zone and would not hold through a wet spring under normal field traffic. Dennis Kavanaugh paused. He looked at her. He looked at Galen. Galen was looking at the back of the room. He thanked her for her comment. He said the bank had commissioned a full land management assessment and that drainage conditions would be evaluated as part of that process. He moved to the next item on his agenda. Nobody else said anything. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Galen Aldrich drove home without speaking much. Claire looked out the window at the dark fields. She didn't say anything either. She had said what she knew. The rest of it wasn't up to her. What Dennis Kavanaugh's land management assessment had not caught, and what Claire had understood from 2 years of walking that fence with her father and one remembered kitchen table conversation, was the specific interaction between the fractured limestone shelf and the original tile installation pattern on the Dunmore North draws. The tile on sections 14 and 15 had been laid in the early 1960s by the elder Dunmore, a man named Harold, who was methodical about most things and who had done the work with a Ford 8N tractor and a 2-bottom plow-mounted tile plow, laying 4-inch clay tile at a depth of roughly 22 inches across the main draws. The tile had functioned adequately for 40 years. The problem, which developed gradually and not entirely visibly, was the limestone shelf. In that part of Crawford County, the verdigris limestone formation runs at variable depth and is heavily fractured in the northeast-southwest orientation. Where the tile crossed that fracture zone, ground movement over decades had shifted the tile joints out of alignment by fractions of an inch. Not enough to stop flow, but enough to allow soil infiltration at the joints during high-flow events. By 2007 or 2008, the infiltration had progressed to the point where a 2-inch rain hitting the draws at field capacity would move enough soil into the tile joints to cause a partial collapse of the tile line within 48 hours. The bank's assessment team had walked the ground in February, which was the wrong month to find a problem that only showed under saturated conditions. They had looked at the tile maps from the 1960s and noted that the system was old but extant. They had not dug test holes at the fracture crossings. They had not asked anyone who had walked that fence in October after a 3-inch rain. Claire had. She'd walked it with Galen in the October of 2009. He had pointed at the wet seep in the draw and said, without particular drama, that the Dunmores had a tile problem that was going to get away from them eventually. It got away from the bank instead. The rain that came in the 3rd week of April 2011 was 4 inches over 36 hours, which was not a record for Crawford County, but was enough to put the draws at full saturation by the morning of the 2nd day. There was nothing unusual about the rain itself. It was a normal Kansas spring rain, the kind that happens every 2 or 3 years, and that the county's better drained ground handles without incident. The north draws on the Dunmore ground, First Consolidated's ground now, did not handle it. The water moved fast into the draws. It loaded the tile beyond design capacity. The fractured joints in sections 14 and 15, which had been infiltrating soil since at least 2007, and which had been carrying that accumulated weakness through 4 springs without a failure event large enough to surface, finally could not hold. Not all at once. First one lateral. Then the connecting header as the blocked flow reversed pressure back through the system. Then the second lateral, 22 minutes later, when the back pressure found the next weakened joint and pushed through it. The process took about 11 hours from the first joint failure to the last collapse. When it was done, there were 4 separate surface blowouts in the draws, each one a crater of displaced gray clay subsoil, 8 feet across at the smallest, 22 feet at the largest, and 700 linear feet of 4-inch clay tile sat collapsed or displaced below them. The North Access Road lost its culvert footing on the east side at approximately 2 in the morning and dropped 14 inches. Nobody saw it happen. The tenant farmer the bank had lined up to plant the north section drove his John Deere 8370R up to the crossing at 7:15 the following morning and stopped the tractor at the edge of the drop-off. He sat there for a moment. He turned off the tractor. He got out and looked. Then he got back in, drove back to his shop, and called the bank's agricultural asset line. He left a message. Dennis Kavanaugh was in Wichita that week for a regional agricultural credit conference. He got the message at 9:40. He drove back to Crawford County that afternoon and was on the ground by 4 o'clock, standing at the edge of the largest blowout in Draw 14, looking at a hole in the earth that had not been there a week before. He stood there for a while. He looked at the displaced clay. He looked at the exposed tile end jutting out of the east wall of the crater. He looked at the field that was supposed to be planted by the end of the week. He did not say anything that anyone recorded. The repair costs came to $138,400. Tile replacement, road restoration, surface grading on the blowouts, and temporary drainage diversion to prevent further failure during the spring wet season. The bank contracted a drainage specialist out of Pittsburgh, a man named Gene Holloway, who had done tile work in Crawford and Cherokee counties for 31 years, and Gene told the bank's asset manager that the failure pattern was consistent with fractured limestone tile joint displacement, that it had been developing for years, and that it would have been visible as a wet seep in dry weather to anyone who had walked that draw in a dry fall. Dennis Kavanaugh asked Gene if there was any way the assessment team should have caught it. Gene said yes. He said you catch it by walking the fence in October and looking at where the water is when there shouldn't be any. He said it the way a man says something when he's answering honestly and wishes the answer were different. 3 weeks later, in May of 2011, Dennis Kavanaugh drove out to the Aldrich farm on a Tuesday afternoon and knocked on the front door. Golan Aldrich answered. Kavanaugh asked if he could speak with Golan and his daughter. Golan was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the door the rest of the way and said to come in. Claire was at the kitchen table doing homework. She was 12 years old. She had a science textbook open and a half-eaten apple on a paper towel beside it. She looked up when Kavanaugh came in and did not appear surprised to see him. Kavanaugh sat down. He said the bank had experienced the drainage failure she had described at the extension meeting. He said the repair had cost the bank $138,400. He said he wanted to ask if she and her father would be willing to walk the rest of the boundary sections with the bank's assessment team and share what they knew about the drainage conditions on the adjoining ground. He said he should have listened at the meeting. Claire looked at her father. Galen looked at Kavanaugh. Galen said they could do that. Claire closed her science textbook. She wrote something in the margin of her spiral notebook. Kavanaugh didn't see what it said. He didn't ask. The Aldriches walked 4 separate boundary sections with the bank's drainage team over the following 2 months. Gene Holloway came along for 3 of those walks. They found 2 additional areas of compromised tile, not failed, but developing the same wet seep signature that Draw 14 had shown in 2009. The bank repaired both preemptively that summer at a combined cost of $31,200 and avoided what Gene estimated would have been a similar failure event within 2 to 3 wet seasons. The bank released the north sections of the Dunmore ground in the fall of 2011, and the tenant operation ran without major drainage issues through the following 3 years. Dennis Kavanaugh transferred to a different regional post in 2013. He sent a brief note to Golan Aldrich before he left, thanking him for the help. He addressed it to Golan. He added a line at the bottom acknowledging Claire's assessment. He spelled her name correctly. Galen kept the note. He put it in a file folder in the farm office, in the drawer where he kept correspondence he considered worth keeping. Claire saw it there once, a few years later. She didn't take it out of the folder. She had not needed the acknowledgement to know she had been right. She had known that in the extension hall in March, before Dennis Kavanaugh had picked up his folder and moved on to the next agenda item. She is 37 now. She farms the Aldrich home place. She raises corn and soybeans and cattle on the same ground her great-grandfather paid $38 an acre for in 1947. She does this with her younger brother, Dale, who came back to the farm in 2017 after 8 years running equipment for a commercial operation in Labette County. She leases an additional 180 acres to the north, some of it the same Dunmore ground she'd walked with her father, which changed hands twice after the bank sold it in 2014, and which she and Dale began renting in 2019 at $112 per acre cash rent. She raises corn and soybeans on the row crop ground and runs a small cow-calf operation on the creek bottom pasture. Not a large operation, not a famous one, just steady, careful, and hers. She walked the Draw 14 blowout site the first fall they had the lease. The ground had been repaired in 2011 and had settled back into pasture grass over the intervening years. You would not have known anything had happened there unless someone had told you where to look, or unless you knew what the seep in dry weather meant, or unless you had stood at that fence line with your father at age 9 and heard him say, quietly, that this draw had a problem that was going to get away from someone eventually. She knew where to look. Patsy Griswold from the Crawford County Extension Office heard the full story eventually, partly from Galen, partly from Gene Holloway, who came in for a seed order one spring and told her about the drainage walks. She thought about the extension hall meeting she had attended that March evening, and the girl in the third row, and the way Dennis Kavanaugh had moved on to the next agenda item. She said she had noticed Claire at the meeting. She hadn't known who she was at the time. She said she didn't know why she remembered it specifically. There was no reason to remember it above anything else that happened that evening. But she had thought, watching the girl sit still while the adults around her shifted in their folding chairs, there is a child paying more attention than most of the people in this room. She had been right about that too. She just hadn't said anything at the time. That is the thing about a warning. It doesn't get easier to hear just because the person giving it is small. And it doesn't stop being true just because the room decides to move on. The draws know what they know. They don't wait for anyone to be ready.